Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for being here. My name is John Shaw. I'm the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute, and want to welcome you to a special event we're having tonight, a conversation with one of the country's best known, most popular, and widely respected journalists, Scott Simon. As you may know, Scott is a native of Illinois, a proud native, I think I can say. Grew up in Chicago, and one of his first jobs in journalism was for NPR in Chicago. He became the Chicago NPR bureau chief and was the very respected and disciplined supervisor of one staffer himself. So it was a very well-run bureau, I've been led to believe.
I understand the challenge of presiding over a large organization, yeah.
Scott, of course, has had this remarkable career at NPR, has done just amazing work. He's worked, I think, in 10 different war zones, has worked in a number of capitals around the world. He's written nearly a dozen books, hosted TV specials, and has written just dozens of thoughtful essays. In 2016, Scott was selected by Governor Rauner as a Lincoln Laureate, which was probably the least controversial thing that Governor Rauner ever did. And the wisest, we think. So we're gonna have a wide-ranging conversation about Scott's career, a lot of focus on Illinois. Scott, as I said, has deep roots here. Later on, we're going to talk a little bit about his friendship and relationship with Paul Simon. I think he received his first letter from Paul Simon when he was 15 or 16. So we will talk about that. And I just want to end this introduction by saying I think maybe some of you saw him here some years ago. In 2009, he gave the Marmaduke Lecture. And I went back in our files, and the title of that talk was, "What's the News When Every Person is His, Her, or Her Own Jimmy Olsen and Perry White?" Sort of invokes a more simple Ozzie and Harriet sort of age. But in that talk, he focused on some of the central issues that still are applicable today, including just the challenge of journalists to challenge their audiences and not tell them necessarily what they want to hear, but the news as it is, factually accurate. So Scott and I are going to converse for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions, and look forward to a great night. So thank you so much. Well, Scott, as I was reading about your career, one thing that surprised me is one of your first jobs was working in a group home for adults with cognitive disabilities. I mean, how did that job come about?
Which is I'm afraid, not how we phrased it in those days. I applied. I had mismanaged an aldermanic campaign in Chicago as opposed to managing one. I think you and I were talking about this the other day. So there were 4 candidates. It was the 46th Ward. And there were 4 candidates, and as I believe I said to you, John, I later ran the numbers and figured out that we would have gotten more votes if I had paid every voter $5, which not unheard of as a campaign tactic in Chicago. But in any event, there were 46th and 48th Ward in Chicago, neighborhood called Uptown. There were any number of homes for mentally challenged adults, which again is not how we phrased it in those days. And I was just drawn in. I love that. So I applied. I also later became director of a drama group at this is a place called the Approved Home, 909 West Wilson Avenue. And I was a case aide. This is where there would be anywhere between 17 or 18 and 25 or 26 adults who would be on my list. And I was held responsible for making certain they took the approved medications, their ablutions for bedtime, or sometimes getting up depending on the shift. And I mean, I will never forget that work. And one of the many things that I went into it. One of the things I didn't like, and I will be careful talking about the politics of it, but there was then a very thickly set Chicago Democratic organization at that particular point. Let me put it that way. And the precinct captains would come in and would help the people who lived in the home fill out their ballot. What an absolutely touching, because I know their only interest was increasing the Democratic franchise, small d. In any event, I didn't like that, and yet it also occurred to me that precinct captain was paying attention to them. And we so-called reformers weren't. And in any event, so I was drawn in by the work, and I remember at first, it's very hard when you walk around because you see art that is made, finger painting and watercolors and that kind of thing. And it looks like something that might have been done by a 5 or 6 year old child. And of course, if it is a 5 or 6 year old child, you say, oh my gosh, another Picasso, another Manet. And that's obviously harder when it's somebody in their 50s. But you know, I was over that in a week, because you begin to know the people there, and you know their personalities, and you begin to know them as people. And then you don't see that kind of thing as sad, and you don't look at their limitations. You begin to see kind of the temple of humanity that's inside. And I was just totally drawn in by that, which is why years later I wind up doing a YA novel about it, which is thoughtfully available on Amazon and independent booksellers. If any of you would be so moved, and just write me at my website and I'll be pleased to. Never mind, I'm sorry, go ahead. But yeah, it was one of the most formative experiences of my life, and I'd been looking over the years for the right way to kind of tell the story, and then wound up with a novel called Sunnyside Plaza. And I just learned so much. I learned so much about the city. I learned the way, and I love this, I learned how a great city can take in so many people that you often walk by, and don't know their stories, but there's something extraordinary going on. Yes, I got kind of an insight as to the political system, but as I say, my thoughts wound up being ambivalent, because though I do think the precinct captain obviously had some selfish interests, they were also paying attention, and the folks who lived in that home counted for something. And performers had kind of glided over that. And in any event, I chose that I couldn't go on doing that kind of work forever. I wanted it to lead, to something else. But I'm so glad I spent the time there that I did, because I absolutely never forgot about it, and it stayed with me.
And your first job in journalism was for kind of an alternative newspaper, is that right? Or tell that story.
It was called Offset Magazine. And, sorry, I can't believe anybody read it at this particular point, but in any event, and we were dedicated to try and, overturning and overthrowing the system as it was, whatever that system was at that particular point. And we covered the stories that the press was afraid to cover, that to a remarkable degree coincided with our own points of view, but I digress. In any event, we sold it, and we sold it on the street. We sold it to people. Actually, I think we did do some good things. I take that back. We did sometimes, challenge what I knew to be the preconceptions of our audience, because when you have such a limited audience, you're able to tell what the preconceptions are, and that was wonderful, and that was wonderful experience, and having to make your own way in the to get anyone to be interested in what you're doing, you have to come up with something, and I found the challenge. I like that, and and I liked the fact that journalism offered you a way of participating in the world. And I suppose almost everything does, Gesundheit. But I remember at the terrible time of 9/11, and my wife and I had been married in 2000, so this happened, actually September 11th, our anniversary is September 3rd. And so this actually happened days after our anniversary, and I was actually in Washington, D.C. that day, but we had a place in Lower Manhattan on Mott Street, which is right above Canal Street, which is where it happened. And so 9/11 occurred, and I immediately got to work. We were called in because is a production unit that knows each other, and somebody was just talking to me outside about remembering those days when, planes were grounded and couldn't get back to where they were going. So we just went on the air overnight to keep people company as much as anything else. Bring them the news, yes, but also keep people company. And I remember saying to my wife then, who at that point was in the film business, I don't know what I'd do if I sold shoes for a living. I don't know what I'd do if I were a lawyer. I don't know what I'd do if I were a contractor. I had something to do. And I think that's one of the fascinations of journalism. We always have something to do. We have something that we can do, that we have to do when times are bad. An old colleague of mine, Bob Edwards, left us recently, and I was at the memorial service, and somebody got up who had been on the staff of Morning Edition that morning, and remembered how it was the only time that Bob had ever given an impromptu kind of speech to his staff, where he said, and obviously I'm paraphrasing from a paraphrase, where he said, this is a terrible event, but we've got work to do, and it's never been more necessary. And that's something I like about journalism.
So how did NPR happen for you? I guess initially as a stringer, and then bureau chief.
I listened, and I liked it. And the best of NPR in those days reminded me of some of the best reporting that I found in Chicago journalism, in the old Chicago Sun-Times and the Daily News. And I could go on, Tom Fitzpatrick, Mike Royko, Ron Powers. I don't want to go on Lois Willie. And it reminded me of that kind of Kai's Beach, Georgianne Geyer, who later wound up being a neighbor, living right below Georgianne. And I do mean below in all ways, Georgianne. Georgianne Geyer was the great acclaimed foreign correspondent for many years at the Chicago Daily News. And in any event, I just was drawn in by the quality of journalism. And I sent them a letter. I might need to explain these days, that's a piece of paper you fold into an envelope. And in any event, and I sent the letter to NPR, and I said I was offering my services as a stringer. And I got a call back from a guy named Joe Olashevitz. And in those days, NPR had a bureau in New York, obviously headquarters in Washington, and had one correspondent on the West Coast in Los Angeles. And he said, I guess we could use some stories from Chicago. What's the name of the place you mentioned? And yes, yeah, it's in between the two. So in any event, and I had been a local reporter. I was at Channel 11 in Chicago in those days, and I began to freelance. For NPR. I mean, one of the first stories I did was when Jimmy Carter had become the Democratic nominee, and he came through Chicago, and it was Mayor Daley, then of Chicago, the first Mayor Daley, who was endorsing him, and there had been some, I think, friction. It's easy to say, but I did a story that tried to kind of interpret what each of them were actually saying in their speeches. And because the Chicago Democratic Organization was not really excited about Jimmy Carter, but on the other hand, they wanted to support and uplift the entire Democratic ticket. And in any event, I think it was one of these speeches that can sound impenetrable to a national audience. So I tried to break it down what it was like locally. So when Mayor Daley, and forgive me, I'm going to do a bad impression, but when he said, and Jimmy Carter is from Georgia, and Georgia voted for Adlai Stevenson. And I explained to the audience that Adlai Stevenson had been from Illinois, and and Georgia voting for Adlai Stevenson was, it was considered an endorsement, and for this guy from Georgia. And so I did that story, and then one night the Chicago L, I think the only time it's happened, it came off a turn going on Lake Street, and that was a big story. And then Mayor Daley died. He died. He had a visit in his. I think he died. He had a heart attack while visiting his doctor's office, or that's where he. And of course, that was a big story nationally, and so was the kerfuffle to replace him at that particular point. And I just loved doing those stories, and so there was a lot to report on, and they offered me a job and decided that opening a bureau in Chicago would be a good idea. Had I been in on the ground floor of NPR, would have suggested beginning with the Chicago bureau. I don't know what they were doing with Washington and New York and Los Angeles, but in any event, so we opened the Chicago bureau.
Well, let's talk about your show. Everyone, as we've been visiting with people, watch it. They wake up to you on Saturday mornings. Let's maybe talk for just a minute about the mechanics of the show, because I know people are always kind of interested in how you do it. Now, you and the Sunday show have a combined staff, as I understand it, of about 16 or so.
Yeah, about that.
And how does it work? I mean, do they have their areas of expertise, or do they pitch it?
They begin to develop areas of expertise. We have a guy named Danny Hensel who handles films for us now. He was, in fact, I don't want to say that I know what his major was, University of Michigan, but very, very involved in films. And Samantha Balaban, who I think name gets PR people in the literary world to jump. She handles books for us, and a man named Michael Radcliffe handles music. And we try and set things up the best way we can, and we want to know, these are features, and we want to know what's coming out, and these things have to often be booked months in advance and go according to a schedule, and we try and have a variety of different kinds of material. We emphasize novels, actually, on our show. We kind of leave nonfiction to the dailies, which I think is a good way of dividing it. We do make an exception for celebrity memoirs. Well, but and we get requests to do celebrity memoirs, so I think that's fine. And movies, we do a little bit of everything. It was very difficult, obviously, during the SAG-AFTRA strike, but I think we're kind of back to that rhythm now. We did a lot of foreign films, and we should do foreign films, but it was, honestly, I was beginning to wonder at that particular point. I wanted to think, gosh, I wish Norway wouldn't come out with another film. This is getting a little thick. But in any event, Danny does a wonderful job with films, many of which wind up being nominated for the top awards. And then, of course, the news is always the news. And so we have our first editorial meeting on Tuesday, and people bring in ideas, and everybody brings in ideas, including me. And then as the week goes on, we have an even bigger editorial meeting on Wednesday. It's hard often, particularly in these days, to know what news is really going to be resonant on Wednesday or on Saturday. So you can come up with an idea that sounds great on Wednesday, but it will have been worked over by the time you get to Saturday. So that's when we have to reassess. And also something which I believe in, maybe there have been studies that can actually document it, but I really believe news breaks on Friday night. And I mean, I hate to say it, it's quite true. Former President Trump sometimes came out with some of his most, I'll just call picturesque tweets on Friday night, even Saturday morning. Forgive me, the late Mayor Daley, anytime he had bad news to break, it would be on a Friday night. And I think that's true of a lot of people in public life. They do that. And we want to be alert for that and more. The news doesn't take any days off at this point. Senate and Congress is that can obviously be a problem, although a lot of them go home on Friday night, so it's hard to talk to them, and then they're not exactly available Saturday morning, but we try and do that live.
What distinguishes a very good show and a great show?
Oh, sometimes it could be an interview that's unlike anything else I think we've heard, and sometimes that's the news, sometimes it's a feature derived from the news. I mean, I remember, this is a few months ago, I interviewed two men in Chicago, and forgive me for drawing a blank on their names, who ran owned and operated a running shoe store that was west of the Loop. And I forget how many times their store had been broken into. And, oh, thank you. I'm being told to talk louder. Have I been? I'm really sorry. Forgive me. You'll regret it. And they had been broken into, I forget how many times at that particular point. So we aired an interview with them where they talked about how difficult it was to stay in business. And so we talked to them Saturday morning, and I believe it was that night they were broken into again. And so we talked to them the following week, and they said, we've had it. We're moving. We can't keep doing that. And look, that was not an optimistic story, but I think it was necessary for people to hear it. We had an interview on this past Saturday with Caleb Carr, the distinguished novelist and military historian, who he'd written a book about his relationship with his cat, Masha, the cat, who was a wild cat, got at a shelter. And they picked each other out at the shelter, and they were together for 17 years, and they got cancer at more or less the same time. And Caleb talked about how much Masha had meant to him in his life and how difficult it was to say goodbye. And this was just it was an uplifting interview in that for those of us who love animals, you understood all over again the closeness of the relationship and how enriched Caleb's life had been by the presence of Masha. And there was a particularly poignant note because Caleb is battling cancer himself. It was last year, we actually had a several-parter where we were present for a 10-way organ transplant at Houston Methodist Hospital. And it was just one of the most extraordinary things that I've ever seen, that I've ever reported on. And I mean, I learned so much. And I remember talking to somebody who was on one of the surgical nurses, and I was prefacing a question to her, and I talked about this miracle that you perform. And she said, don't call it a miracle. She said, this is plumbing to us. This is car repair. And she said, look, nobody's going to volunteer for a medical miracle. But we can do this. This is hooking, A to B and all that sort of thing, which I thought was amazing. There was a young couple, and the wife had been in dialysis. And some of you who are baseball fans will, I think, particularly catch this reference. And I walked into their room. It was the night before surgery. And her husband was wearing a Houston Astros cap. And I said, I know it's an important time. Can we ask you some questions? And he said, well, I don't know if I'll have any answers, but you can ask. And I said, with his Astros cap on, I said, I tell you what, when I ask a question, I will bang on this garbage can to let you know the answer. And there's a cheating scandal where the Houston Astros were accused of sending signals to their batters that way. And he just laughed and laughed, and we became very close to, I said, and I hugged them before the surgery. I said, you've got this. And one of the things that still stays with me is I happen to know, because we talked to all the people beforehand, there were some families who were Trump supporters. There were some families who were not Trump supporters. Some were Republicans, some Democrats. But doctors went to them and said, you can help save somebody's life, and they didn't hesitate. Nobody said, oh, I'm not going to give my kidney to someone like that, and it was just a wonderful reminder to do that story and to be reminded both of the medical arts and what they can do and the dedication of medical professionals, but also the ordinary people that got caught up in that story, and I do mean caught up in all ways. And that to me, I sometimes despair, and I mean this with respect in a university community, that sometimes we talk to too many self-proclaimed experts. And I think that's good and necessary, but that the real job of journalism is talk to people who have no portfolio, no title, who don't necessarily have, hyphens in their job description, but to talk to people who are affected by events, to talk to citizens, because I think that's what journalism can do, and that's I got one of these lifetime awards recently, and found myself reflecting on the fact that some of the greatest journalism we've read, and by the way, a lot of it here in Chicago, or Chicago is a city that's, some of you may have been there at one particular point. They root for a team called the Cubs there, right? I'm elaborately respectful of the fact that we're in Cardinal territory here, and I will be as respectful as I can. They're still in the league. I'm trying to be respectful. I asked a question. I mean, they're really restive, aren't they?
They are.
But all right, so I will end that. In any event, great journalism written by Martha Gellhorn and Ernest Hemingway, and they're lyrical stories about real people, and that's what lasts. That's what inform us, and that's what we take in life.
Scott, I want to talk about some of your writing and comments on Illinois, because I know you're deeply connected. And I read an article, and I clipped it some years ago, and I went back to my files. But it was, and you probably don't remember specifics, but just maybe reflect on the broad impetus. It was about Caterpillar leaving Peoria. And this was, they were leaving Peoria to go to Deerfield, and then they ended up moving to Texas. But I want to read a couple sentences, and maybe have you reflect on it. You said, you were just saying, you were talking about just how it was going to affect the community. You get me choked up here. But it just says, who'll buy the box seats to cheer the Peoria Chiefs? Who's going to support the symphony? Who's going to support the zoo? the Riverfront Museum. Talk about what pulled you into that story.
Well, I had been to Peoria
To become a Lincoln laureate.
to become a Lincoln laureate, and I will explain parenthetically that my wife is French, and at the time we married, she knew New York and she knew the Bay Area, and I think had changed planes in Chicago. Now, my wife is not a snob. Are people here familiar with Garrett's popcorn in Chicago? Yeah, okay, all right. The caramel and cheese blend, they call that the Chicago blend. And I remember our first visit to Chicago. It was like in the middle of winter. And maybe it wasn't our first, but it was, I think it was our first holiday. It was our first holiday. And we were taking the trip around the Loop on the elevated train. And she saw the long line in front of the Garrett shop on Lake Street. And she said, "What's that?" And I had never, I don't eat that way. Our entire family love it now, particularly our children, to say the least. And I said, "Oh, it's Garrett's popcorn. It's a Chicago institution." So we got off and we went down there. And my elegant, cosmopolitan French wife with her elevated taste was going, "I've never had anything so wonderful in all my life." Garrett's popcorn. So she's not a snob. I got the call from Governor Rauner's office about being a Lincoln laureate. And I called my wife up and I was crying, which, as you have already observed, is so rare for me. And my wife she said, "Oh, darling, this is wonderful, and we will have such a wonderful time, a family trip to Chicago." And I said, "Actually, the ceremonies aren't in Chicago this year." And she said, "Oh, well, we've been planning a family trip to Springfield." I said, "It's actually not in Springfield." And she said, "Where is it?" And I said, "Well, it's in Peoria." She said, "Peoria?" Which is not familiar in the French landscape. Let me go. By the way, I have learned, because of my wife, do you know how many names here in Illinois we've been mispronouncing? I just want to, Joliet, right? Bourbonnais, right? I remember one of our early marital trips was to Detroit, which of course is in Michigan, but in any event, so we went to Peoria, and we had a great time as a family at the Caterpillar Museum, where you can drive tractors, and it was wonderful. And I was just so touched by that, because I have done lots of stories over the years where somebody makes a financial decision, and you maybe understand it in those terms, but it has widespread repercussions and effects in the community, and that just hurts, and that's something that that bears a witness, that needs it. And loving the state as I do, I was particularly touched by that.
You had a terrific interview with Jesse White as he was leaving after 24 years. Talk about that. And you had seen the tumblers on multiple occasions.
I have seen the Jesse White tumblers. I've seen all over this state. It was just just wonderful. I enjoyed talking to him a lot, because talk about a life in public service. In all ways. His career with the tumblers and in schools, and certainly a Secretary of State, which is not. How do I put this nicely? Not an office that is always distinguished by statesmanship. Can I say that in Southern Illinois? Can I? Yeah. All right. In any event, and I'd encountered him obviously a number of times over the years, and I also remember spending any number of election days in Chicago, and we would be going around to see various polling stations, and Jesse White was showing up at one polling station after another, bringing snacks for the election workers who were there. And I always thought that was so nice and so thoughtful. So I really enjoyed talking to Secretary of State White. Can I tell a story?
Sure.
So one of my first sort of forays in investigative journalism was working on an investigation, and I have told this story, by the way. I was invited to be a speaker a few years ago, Better Government Association. It was a Better Government Association interview, a Better Government Association investigation of George Dunn, who was then the chairman of the Cook County Board. And he ran an insurance company on the north side of Chicago, and they needed someone to dress up. I guess they'd gotten a legal ruling that your trash doesn't belong to you once you put it out there. And they had reason to think, or they had a suspicion, that there was an astonishing correlation between the people who were doing business, the companies that were doing business with Cook County, and clients at Near North Insurance that was run by George Dunn. And so what they wanted was for someone to pick up the trash, because there would be copies of correspondence in those sheets that used to be the one-piece carbons. Now, I did that. I mean, I dressed up in black. I took, a gym bag. It was 3 a.m. and the cover story was supposed to be, that I was trying to break it in underground news. I was trying to big a big story, and I thought I was not necessarily supposed to reveal I was part of a Better Government Association investigation. Nothing ever happened. I can't say that loud enough. Nothing ever happened. The Better Government Association found nothing on Commissioner Dunn, who was also chairman of, that's right, it's coming back to me, the Cook County Democratic Party. He retired. There was, forgive another parenthetical, after his wife died of cancer, there was a report that the Better Government Association broke that he was apparently having a relationship, how do I say this, romantic relationship with two people who were on his personal security guard. They were part of the sheriff's police. And the Better Government Association broke this story and suggested there was something improper in it, as I guess technically there might have been. But the Better Government Association was quite forthright about saying their phone was ringing off the hook with people calling up saying, "How can you do this? The poor man is a grieving widow. And having sex with two women and a secure, what does he eat for breakfast?" And so it was that brought George Dunn's name back into the news. So a number of years ago, I decided to do a profile of George Dunn. And we get there and introduce myself, and it began on election morning, so this was like 5 o'clock in the morning at his party headquarters on North Clark Street. And I said, "I feel moved to confess something to you, Commissioner Dunn." And I told him about I went through your trash. And so for the rest of the day, we would go to polling stations, we would go to party offices. He would say, "Come over here," and he would put his arm around me and say, "You know what this fucking son of a bitch did to me once?" We spent the entire day with him, and it stretched on until night, and we wound up going to his favorite restaurant together. And I said, "Commissioner Dunn, I feel I have to at least buy the first round. I mean, because, and he said, No, you were just doing your job. You were just doing your job." And I thought, yeah, thank you. That was, so. Well, what were we talking about?
Actually, where I wanted to go, which is to talk about the press and current politics, and particularly the 2024 election. And let me frame it this way. I was, The Atlantic a couple months ago had a cover story on what happens if Donald Trump is reelected. And there was one essay that was called, "Is Journalism Ready?" And it was by George Packer.
Yeah,
I want to read a couple sentences and then have you reflect. He said, "The relationship between Donald Trump and the news media has always been a little disingenuous, like a pair of fighters trading insults and throwing air punches at a weigh-in. The hostility is real, but the performance benefits both sides." And he goes on to say that Trump professes scorn, et cetera, for the press, but also is very assiduous in cultivating at least certain parts of the press. And the press is very assiduous about recording the number of things that he says that are not accurate, but pounces on every tweet and magnifies it. And he ends his little section by quoting the former president of CBS News saying, "Donald Trump may not be good for America, but he's damn good for CBS News." Yeah. So how should the press cover this presidential campaign, and how should they cover Donald Trump? You have an hour.
Are we running out of time? I think something's about to happen to my voice, and I wouldn't. Most honest answer is I don't know, and we have to keep doing better. I don't necessarily know what the solution is. I mean, the fact is you have to cover somebody who stands a more than mathematical chance of becoming president again. You have to cover somebody who is on trial as we speak now in New York. I think there has been less coverage of his tweets, but obviously if he becomes president again, those can be implications of policy. And I'm not in favor of being so above the battle that you say we can't cover that. And obviously one of the challenges is that he is important to millions of Americans. And this is one of the things that I worry about in the news industry overall, and it's what's been called compartmentalization, siloization. You can choose any kind of news you want at this particular point. You don't have to be disturbed by a fact that disputes your point of view of the world. And I think the whole idea of journalism is to do stories that challenge your idea of the world, that take a subject and say, we know you think you probably knew about this, well, let's give you another aspect to the story. And I believe in broadcasting, not narrowcasting. Broadcasting, with a voice that can reach people all across the spectrum. I mean, there have been, some jokes recently about and believe you me, we make them ourselves, about the kind of stereotypical NPR audience of, white wine swilling, sandal wearing, vegan. I don't have sandals on tonight, I want you to observe. And I ate non-vegan pancakes with you for breakfast this morning. But all of that being said, I don't think that has to do with our backgrounds, but I do think it's important to do stories that sometimes challenge the view of the world that everybody has. And I despair of the fact that we're just kind of nourishing ourselves in our own news silos at this particular point. And the stories that can really inform and reflect people, I think can get so easily overlooked because the algorithms don't push them to where people can notice them, or they can, just tune out if that's what they want to do on NPR. I still believe it's worth making the effort. So in terms of covering the campaign ahead, obviously it's always a challenge to cover a presidential campaign day by day by day because typically candidates repeat themselves. That's just, some lines work better than others, they repeat themselves. Every now and then you'll have a so-called major address about something, but I think, and then what winds up sometimes being new of a day is a gaffe or a slip, which may not really be that newsworthy, but because it's new, it becomes reported sometimes all out of proportion. I was lucky enough to get my first experience covering a presidential campaign. John Anderson from Illinois, and I was assigned because I was in Illinois, and who, by the way, was very good friends with someone we know, with Paul Simon. And I just loved covering that campaign. I thought it was great fun. in a sense, we can forget he was really considered to have a chance when he began that campaign. And a couple of things I learned. One was, you can be running at like just 5% in the polls, but you have Secret Service protection. When you show up at an airport, you get a police guard, and there's a crowd to hear you. And so if you're covering that campaign, you're thinking, well, polls must be wrong. Look at this crowd, And you forget. I mean, it reminds me of, I don't mind saying, a friend of ours who ran for governor of Ohio years ago and was defeated. We were having dinner with him several weeks after his defeat, and he was saying, I saw the polls, and I would say, wait a minute, people love me. They've loved me all my life. I've been winning elections since I was in the 7th grade. What do you mean I'm not going to win? And I think that's true of a lot of politicians. So I learned then that what you're seeing on the ground can not be a good guide to what is actually happening. And I learned, if you're covering that campaign, you want to get on the air. And the closer we got to the actual election, they were getting fewer stories from our campaign because Mr. Anderson was hovering at like 5 or 6% in the polls, and it just didn't seem to be as relevant as the two major party candidates. And so, a man who's still a friend of mine was a television producer for ABC, and he got the idea, one way to get on the air. John Anderson was having a campaign event in Hartford, Connecticut, and he hired a helicopter to take video of the campaign event because he knew that would get on the air because it was a good shot. And that if you actually just relied on what the candidate was going to say, yet you should have coverage every day. I think it would be irresponsible not to. I remember, and I hope I'm not telling tales out of school, but we were having an editorial meeting one day. I think this was the 2020 campaign. It was the 2020 campaign. And one of our producers, and I think you ought to be able to trot out any idea in an editorial meeting without feeling ridiculous, or it's okay to laugh, but he said, there's so many people that say that they're just sick and tired of this campaign. Why don't we try going a week without any campaign news? And we're all sitting there going, And then I finally said, we can't do that. We can't, people turn to us for the news. But I just hope as we go along, what can I tell you? That be responsible and fair. And part of that is obviously going to be fact checking, and that happens with some candidates more than another. But Donald Trump benefits from the fact that he has many of his supporters say, well, don't take him literally, take him figuratively, and that. Let's put it this way, when we do our job and do that, I'm not certain a lot of people who support him care one way or another. So I'm not sure it's having the effect that people think that it should have.
Great. I have plenty more questions, but I'd like to turn it over to the audience and give you all a chance to pose a question to Scott.
Scott, it's great to have you back in Carbondale. I've had the pleasure of speaking to you several times over the years. And in our lifetime in covering politics, we've seen 4 Illinois governors go to jail. We've seen numerous state legislators.
I think I said this on the air, that in addition to Land of Lincoln, it should say, Illinois, a state so great the governors make our license plates.
Exactly. My question to you is...
I just want to point out that my Lincoln Laureate was awarded under one of the few Illinois governors in recent years who hasn't been indicted yet. So I kid people like Michael Beschloss, the historian, Scott Turow, the great novelist. Theirs came from Governor Blagojevich. Really, how do How do they have the nerve? You know, I say that with respect to two good friends. Sorry.
I guess my question is, what's in the water in Illinois or in the political culture that leads to this?
I have enjoyed contemplating that question all of my life. And I believe some of you might know, I actually did an essay a few weeks ago. I forget what Paul Powell's house in Vienna, not Vienna. I remember the conversation I had with one of our editors. No, I know in Austria it's Vienna. In Illinois, it is Vienna. But in any event, pardon me? Oh, it's Wien. Thanks for reminding me. Right, Wien. Absolutely. Thank you. So I think for years it's been maintained as a museum, which I think is kind of hilarious, but you know, God bless. And now I think the house is being sold on the open market. And this place of history. In any event, I suggested that it should be turned into a tourist attraction called Paola Land. And given Illinois' political history, you could, you know, it could be kind of a theme park for political corruption. And instead of a ride called Pirates of the Caribbean, you could have Pirates of Vienna, and you know, and I lovingly offered a suggestion to my home state that I thought would be helpful, and you'd be amazed how many people thought I was joking. Really, I find this very disappointing. I don't know what there is in the water. I don't mind saying this. I have enjoyed covering Chicago politics and Illinois politics. We should remind ourselves every now and then it's not just theater, that there is a real cost for that kind of corruption, and it comes in 100 and 1,000 different ways. And I think people need to be aware of it and not just nod and say, oh, that's, oh, what do you expect of an alderman anyway? I mean, I wrote one of my novels is I call it people used to sometimes refer to it as a political satire, and I would say, no, there's nothing satiric about it at all. It's set in the Chicago City Council. That's how they actually are. A political comedy called Windy City. And derived, by the way, from as I think a lot of you probably as Illinoisans will probably know, the term Windy City is not because of the wind off the lake, but it referred to very pompous politicians. That's absolutely true. See, fact check me. Go ahead, Google it. In any event, I spent a lot of time with aldermen at that particular point, and it was very funny because I would tell them what I was doing. It was like they had been waiting all of their careers for someone to discover the importance of what they did. And I must say I had a great time and made, carefully friendships as a novelist. I was really moved. Someone who is, and there are 50 aldermen in Chicago, I probably don't have to tell you, they are on call all the time. There's a flake of snow, their cell phone in their pocket begins to ring because you gotta get this street cleared. That sort of thing. It's a tough job, and it is also not lost on me. There was all right, I'm not going to make too much of an effort to check what I'm going to say. There was a reform politician who became governor years ago named Dan Walker, who I probably don't need to explain is one of the Illinois governors who wind up going to prison. He was a reformer. I mean, and I remember being at some function in the State House when he was governor, and he came over and he said, Scott, this is a bad imitation. Is Governor Walker still with us? Or I think he's gone, right? Yeah. Okay. Forgive me. And he said, you know, Scott, I have nothing to do with machine politics or with shoebox politics. And, you know, this was a few years before we found out he actually had a lot to do with that, you know. And I'm impressed by the number of, I mean, I could name them, reformers in Illinois who wind up, you know, who have wound up on the wrong side of a corruption scandal. And and I've often thought, if I might say this as a son of Illinois, that, you know, maybe people like me should not enjoy it as much as we do and become a little bit more, in the most creative way, intolerant of it. But I don't know if there's and look, I'm not proud of this, but I find myself in Washington, D.C. boasting about, you guys in New Jersey and Louisiana think that's something? Well, let me tell you about Paul Powell. Now that's a story, Sorry.
Other questions?
Sir, from your perspective, looking back and kind of looking forward too, how do you see NPR attracting viewers with so many news sources out there now? How do you stay relevant in the world of news?
Well, I hope by telling the truth and have a broad selection of stories that range around the world, and telling the stories well and lyrically. I like to think that there is a big audience for that. And one of the things that I have discovered over the years, and it's just life, there'll be a crisis, it'll occur. The nation will get gripped by a story, and people will be searching for a voice, a source of news, companionship. And I think that's often where they find us. And then if even a quarter of the people who find us under those circumstances stay with us, that's building the audience. And that's what I hope for, as I often tell people, yes, of course, NPR has a business plan, and it's across all different platforms and platforms, I hate that word, but there you go, all different forms. But we also have a purpose. And I think the purpose is to freely and fairly inform the American public in a way that serves them in all ways and stays with them. And when I mean serves them, I remember years ago, we were doing a story about a gun control proposal that was on the ballot in the state of Maryland. And to this day, some of the most outspoken and vivid opponents of gun control I've ever interviewed were in the inner city of Baltimore. And they would say to me, well, maybe where you live in Georgetown, ouch, you called the police and they're there in 2 minutes. But when we call them here, they never come. They take their time. And when I would say to them, sounding very much like, if I may, the wounded white liberal, but don't you know, according to statistics, the gun you keep in your home is more likely to be used on you than anyone else, they would say to me, you let me worry about that. You just let me take care of my family. And that gun you deride as, a cheap Saturday night special, that's our home security system, and we need one here. And we put that story on the air, and a lot of our listeners were upset. I hate to say it, but in many ways they had profiled that community of inner city Baltimore as knowing their viewpoint. And it was not the viewpoint that we heard. And I think that's where journalism lives, in surprising people, in not saying, well, we know what you think, and we're going to find some voices around the country who agree with you. Here they are. I think journalism, lies in making discoveries like that. I think that's very important.
You strike me as supremely empathetic. When you have a story with a very sad or touching conclusion or part of the story, how do you hold it together?
Well, I mean, I think as you've seen tonight, I usually don't. Our staff, our staff makes jokes about how easy it is to get me to cry, and take bets on it too. I mean, it probably shows up in like FanDuel now. How many times is he going to cry on the air this week? I mean, I try and be professional, but sometimes I just can't. Sometimes I just can't fight it back, and at some point I guess I just stopped trying. I don't know. I can't control it. When our oldest daughter first went off to college in Baltimore, I should explain. Every time our daughters passed a certain milestone, I'm like in a puddle. And when our youngest daughter began kindergarten, the principal of the school had seen me break up when our older daughter had begun. And so she came over to me and she said, "Now, Mr. Simon, I will not have you crying here. It will upset the children. If you can't control yourself, I want you to get over there with the coffee and the donuts and the, I mean, have you ever, to see, so they make the kindergartners hold hands and they're looking up and it's like, you think dead man walking, and it seems from that. I just, and 6 hours later she was fine. But in any event, my wife and I talked about this, and she said, "Darling, I do not want you crying when we say goodbye to our daughter. I do not want you crying." She was in college in Baltimore. And we got there, and I'm, "Okay, baby, yes, sir. Hey, well, guess we'll be going now." And I hugged her, and despite everything, the tears began to come out. And my wife later said that that was good, because otherwise our oldest daughter would have thought that I had died. So just being hugged, and then we were driving back from the college in Baltimore to Washington, D.C., and we stopped at Trader Joe's. And for the first time, it occurred to me that all of these things I had spent years knowing, oh, she'll love this, she'll love that, there was no need to put it into the basket, and I just broke down right there. You can imagine what a terrific embarrassment this is for my wife. I can't control it. Sorry, forgive me, I'll be all right. Yeah. But I will say in my defense, I've covered a lot of wars over the year. It's not like when I'm around gunfire that I burst into tears or something. It's something that has to, it's not so much about being frightened as just some sort of initial chord of empathy. I can't explain it. I don't know. I just moved just to... Sorry.
Scott, my wife tells a story that I think she was listening to NPR, and you were interviewing, was it Dame Edna?
Oh, God, yes.
And did you literally fall off your chair laughing?
I did literally fall off my chair laughing.
What was the context there?
Well, this is interesting. I think I can say it here at the Paul Simon Institute, because that will class it up. When Dame Edna, who was actually, of course, an Australian actor named Barry Humphries, died, so many people remember that interview. Our producer, Sarah Lucy Oliver, found it and concluded there were parts of it we can't run anymore. Because authoritative tastes have changed. Let me put it that way. But I don't mind telling the backstory. He was going to tour the United States as Dame Edna, and I wanted to talk to him about his entire career. He'd been in the original cast of Oliver, and he also did a character named Rod Mackenzie, who was an Australian who, talked about vomiting a lot and that sort of thing. And but then something terrible happened to one of his daughters, and his PR people called and said, "Look, he's going to do the tour. He needs to get back to work, but he just wants to be Dame Edna. he doesn't want to talk about, and I thought, okay, that's fine. So we were interviewing Dame Edna and Barry Humphries, who, by the way, looked, a fedora and beautiful tweeds, and so he became Dame Edna right before our eyes, and he was talking about traveling. He said, Dame Edna was talking, I do travel with my personal gynecologist. And it's Julio Iglesias' father. Julio, by the way, I thought he was making this up, but Julio Iglesias' father was, in fact, a gynecologist. Said, and he's 81 years old, so when he examines me every morning, his hands do shake a bit, but that's not altogether a drawback now, is it? And I just fell off the chair laughing. It was on rollers, and I fell off the chair laughing. Barry Humphries was an absolutely, great guy, and they were doing the inevitable CD about, portraits of artists on NPR, and somebody suggested the Dame Edna interview, and this is just a few years before he died. He called me and he said, it gave me so much pleasure to hear you falling on your arse again. So, yeah.
Maybe I have one more question, but does anyone else have one? Yeah.
As somebody who spends a lot of time researching news stories, you probably come to some informed or develop some informed opinions about them. What is the role of objectivity? Is objectivity desirable in the news when you have the capacity to analyze something and come up with an opinion based on the knowledge that you've developed?
For some people, objective has become an undesirable word. I don't have a problem saying it, at least in the way I know what it means. I sometimes will prefer, though, to say fair. And I think it means, questioning everything and questioning the conclusions of everything, and taking a look at supporting data that doesn't necessarily confirm exactly what you're, the conclusion that you're reaching. I might be misstating this a bit, but there was a study recently that came out that showed that the historically high rate of infant mortality we have in this country may be a process of incorrect data, that people were entering the data incorrectly. And it reminded me, I was on a plane trip, I think it was last week, maybe the week before, and the flight was delayed 6 hours. Now, I don't know what your experience has been, but when I have a flight, it seems to me almost from the moment we land, I get a customer satisfaction survey asking me to, this flight landed, no customer satisfaction survey. And that can be done with data. And yet, you can say, well, according to our customer satisfaction survey, this is that. And so I think we have to be careful about that. I think we have to be careful when people say, well, the data shows this and the data shows that. And that absolutely must also be true of polls. I think polls have to be taken seriously. They're real news, but there can be a difference between people who say something to a pollster and what they actually do, even if they vote. And one of the things that I think our show is going to take a special interest this year, actually, we're going to do a few pieces. We're going to take a look at the voting behavior of older voters. Can I say senior citizens here? And by the way, I am the host that is uniquely set up with a perspective and point of view about this. But as I was saying to people on our staff and our news, obviously there's a question to be explored when you have two candidates who are of the advanced age, if I can say that fairly, that they are. And as I've said to people on our staff, it has been my experience that, in fact, some of the people to raise the sharpest question about the mental acuity of an older candidate for president, or emotional acuity or judgment, are actually people who are senior citizens, who are not defensive about it, but who will, who will say something like, well, I'm 78 and I'm glad I'm, that, and I think that's important to be able to capture that. But it's also important to be able to capture everything that they're thinking and saying, because of all of those demographic groups that we identify, they vote in highest percentage. And I don't think that's a drawback. I think these are people voting with a wealth of experience, a lifetime of experience, a sense of judgment, people who have seen more. So I think the fact that they're exercising their democratic franchise, small d, and actually voting in a higher percentage is something that can actually reassure us about democracy. I think that's good.
Scott, let's wrap it up by some reflections on Paul Simon. You knew him, you had correspondence with him. Tell us about how you knew Paul and...
I was state student council president in Illinois, and Paul had just been elected lieutenant governor. And I sent him a note, and he said, yes, Paul Simon would like to meet Scott Simon, and that's the first time that we met. And over the years, I think I can say we became friendly. My mother wound up marrying a man named Ralph Newman, who ran the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. Paul, of course, had written a great book about Abraham Lincoln. And so we see him at Lincoln stuff, and then political events over the years. I will add parenthetically, there was a Chicago alderman named Seymour Simon, and it was at some Democratic Party event I was covering, and I was there, and there was Paul Simon, Seymour Simon, and me. And Mitch Lozen of the Chicago Tribune said, okay, I want to get a picture of you three together. Nobody believes it, because I was always getting asked, are you any, and I would say, oh, damn it, no, I really am not. When I did a book on adoption, I didn't just tell the story of our family, which has been blessed by adoption, but also Senator Simon, Paul Simon's family. Son Martin, which is a wonderful story. The book is called Baby, We Were Meant for Each Other. I don't have the bin number, but in any event, you can be ordered. And then I was telling Sheila Simon this story. I think my stepfather, Ralph Newman, died in 1999, and did your mother die in 2000 or something? And it was like 2003 or 2002, and Senator Simon called me up about something here. I forget, what, I think they're just getting started. And he said, how's your mother doing? And I said, well, she's fine, Senator, but it's losing someone you love and been with for so many years, that's tough. And Senator Simon said to me, well, a pretty gal like that won't be lonely for long. And I came home to my wife and I said, I think Senator Simon's hitting on my mother. And I said, this is great because P.S., we have the cocktail napkins, already. And I said, I can get used to calling him Dad. This would just... But they wound up marrying other people. Yeah. Oh, well, in any event, I don't mind saying, I'm going to get weepy again. I've never known a person in public life or private life who was a better human being than Paul Simon. And that's particularly something when you talk about all the easy temptations that there are in political life and in public life. And he was like, inured to all of them. He just wanted to do good for people. And God, I absolutely admired him. And I think I can say that in a nonpartisan way, because, this is a nonpartisan institute, but he had many friends in what was then the Republican Party who including John Anderson, Jim Edgar, I mean, it go on, who felt that way very strongly about him too. And I think the temptations to get diverted by this or that, allured by this or that, to use your influence and name in all the wrong ways, which has happened to some of our governors, if not all of them. He wanted to do good. And I think the longer I go on in life, the more I recognize there's no higher compliment than that.
Great. Scott, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.